The satellite is fired up once again, this time from Los Angeles. It's Doug Drexler, makeup and visual effects artist amongst many other talents. Doug, thanks so much for joining me, mate.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Matt. And congratulations on a decade. A decade. That's something to be proud of.
I know.
I'm proud of you.
Makes me feel old every time I say it.
I'm making you feel old.
Well, look, Doug, it's been absolutely fantastic to get to know you on Facebook, but and everything that you've done. But I just wanted to bring it back a bit and chat about where you began, how you got started in this industry. I think, as you said off camera, 31 years ago.
Well, I mean, I was always a huge science fiction geek. I was a very literate kid. I read all the classics, and when I was a kid, and we're talking the early to mid 60s, there wasn't a lot of really great science fiction on television at the time. I mean, of course there was The Twilight Zone. Outer Limits gets honorable mention, you know. But the type of stuff that I loved, outer space stuff with spaceships and technology and things like that, there really wasn't anything that great. It was all, actually, for the most part, it was pretty silly stuff. I mean, I'm a Lost in Space fan. I love Lost in Space, but let's face it, it's pretty goofy. It's some silly stuff. You got to really suspend disbelief to enjoy it, which I have no problem doing that. But, you know, when Star Trek came along in '66, it really spoke to me like nothing else I had seen before. You could tell that the people behind it really loved the genre. And that was like gasoline for me. Being 13 or 14 years old when the show first came on, pivotal, absolutely pivotal. And I have to put a lot of credit has to go to Stephen E. Whitfield, AKA Stephen Poe, who wrote The Making of Star Trek, which came out I think it was during the show's second season. And I mean, you gotta picture this 14-year-old kid gets this book, and it's not just about spaceships and ray guns. This 14-year-old kid is reading, I'm looking at memos and call sheets and budgets, and it was mind-blowing. It was an epiphany for me to see how television works. So I did meet Stephen years later, and I let him know what a difference he made in my life. I mean, the book really is a textbook, and anybody who's interested in television production should read The Making of Star Trek. It's absolutely an incredible book.
Now, I've been reading up on you online just before the interview, and I believe that you had a little Star Trek store in the very beginning in Manhattan. Is that true?
Yeah. Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, I'm an original fan. I'm one of the original fans. I was part of the Save Star Trek campaign that got a third season that really was kicked off by B. Joe Trimble. I was at the very first Star Trek convention in New York City where Gene Roddenberry ran the 16mm projector and narrated the blooper reel. I mean, at that time, Star Trek was not hip. It wasn't cool. A lot of people love it now, but back then, if you liked Star Trek, you were considered a nut, which maybe there's some truth there. I am a nut, but yeah. So I had always been involved with the convention scene, and ended up making contact with a guy named Ron Barlow, who was opening a store at 53rd and 3rd in Manhattan, which is some prime real estate, opening a Star Trek store, which is absolutely absurd, especially at 53rd and 3rd. Anyway, he opened the store. I ended up working with him there, and there had never been anything quite like it before. I think there wasn't even a Starlog magazine at the time. And the internet back then were fanzines. You know, that's how fans communicated with each other, through fanzines. And at the Federation Trading Post, it was really the first place where, I mean, today you could go on the internet and find anything. It's practically the entire world is all in one place at your fingertips. Back then, 1975 or something like that, to have a store where everything was all pulled together in one place where you could get fanzines, model kits, books, uniforms, slides, it really was kind of revolutionary. It was the leading edge of a wave that was about to hit when the conventions became huge, and they became gigantic. So yeah, we had this store. It was really funny when we first opened it. Like nobody showed up, and the local merchants were laughing at us. It was kind of embarrassing. And they used to, WPIX in New York City was showing reruns of Star Trek at like midnight. And we saved up our money, and we put a 20-second ad on television in New York City. It was just a slide that advertised the store. And the next morning, there was a line around the block to get into this place. And it lasted for years. It was amazing. And this was really the first time, I think, that we realized how big a thing Star Trek was destined to become. As a matter of fact, because of that store, we ended up doing one of the very first Star Trek magazines ever. We did, I don't know if you've ever seen the Star Trek poster books that came out. That even predated Starlog. Check on eBay, you know. We were writing very sophisticated articles and pictorials. You know, I did a big pictorial on the Enterprise filming miniature that's at the Smithsonian that today is considered a classic. Little did we know, you know, I mean. But yeah, we ran a store in Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan.
Unbelievable. Well, as you said, the things you can learn online now that just weren't possible all those years ago. As someone, as we were saying off camera, as someone so young, it's very hard to imagine a world without the internet or even to a degree Star Trek. I mean, I was born in '86, so Star Trek's always been there for me as part of my life, right up until 2005 when Enterprise was cancelled. It's just very hard to listen to those stories and try and imagine what that would have been like. But I guess we're going through that now, and it's been 10 years since Enterprise cancelled, and the bones are starting to twitch. Come on, give me another Star Trek fix.
Well, you know, there's a drought right now for this type of science fiction. For me, it's particularly frustrating. The last couple of movies, which I don't want to. I'm not criticizing, but maybe I am a little bit. For me, the best Star Trek is Star Trek that's introspective, sensitive Star Trek that has ideas, and I think that what we're getting in the movies is a lot more like cotton candy, you know. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think we're all jonesing for a Star Trek that's a little bit more thoughtful, a little deeper than what we're seeing in features. I mean, the truth is that movies and television have really evolved over the last 20 years. And when you do a movie, people won't sit still for very sophisticated fare, very introspective, or you know, movies are giant car chases usually now with gigantic explosions. And I mean, look, you've got to, every 8 pages, there's got to be an explosion, otherwise people get bored. Television, on the other hand, has kind of picked up that mantle, and I think that you find more interesting, sophisticated stuff happening on television. And I think that television is really the best place for Star Trek. And actually, I think it's really the best place for science fiction, because science fiction is about ideas, lots of ideas. And to just do a movie where you ultimately end up having to save the universe, it gets, for me, that gets kind of dull. The television
and repetitive as well, I guess.
And repetitive. I hope to see Star Trek return to TV, and I hope that we get to see some more interesting, thoughtful, philosophical stuff that really, I mean, look, you just had Rod in here. Gene was always interested in talking about, Star Trek was really a vehicle for talking about what it means to be a human being. And Star Trek was a perfect place to do that. You have a character like Spock and other aliens, which are like, to hold us up against. That's what I'm begging you guys. Hello, Paramount, please give us Star Trek back on TV.
I think also too we sort of share the same sort of viewpoint with what the J.J. Abrams take on Star Trek, and I think that I very much did not like the 2009 movie, which is, it's very hard to, that was the first time I'd ever written a review for a movie that people hadn't seen, and I was one of the first to see it. And it was very hard, especially for a humble old little Star Trek website, to say I hated this. When Paramount, you sort of get that, Paramount are letting me into this movie, I've got to make it nice and it's got to be wonderful, and no matter what I think. But I sort of took that and I went, well, it's a good movie, but for Star Trek, now I'm talking of 2009, for a Star Trek movie, it's just not there. As you say, there's too much explosions, there's too much. It was too much of a paradigm shift for me of what Kirk, Spock and McCoy and even the Enterprise were. But he sort of, and I don't know whether it was a conscious thing by JJ, I would love to sit down with him to find out, but with Into Darkness, he sort of brought me back, and the way that he did it, and although it was just a repeat of The Wrath of Khan, and spoilers, but it was Kirk instead of Spock that was facing death.
I heard about that. I haven't seen the latest one, and I probably will watch it on DVD later on. I have to admit that the first time when I watched the first movie, I found it to be painful. It was a painful experience for me, and I went to Rod's screening, and honestly, I left after about 15 minutes. I could not finish it. I think I left at about the time where the enlightened Starfleet guy yells, "I can't wait to kick some Romulan ass." I was out. That was it. I was like, Gene Roddenberry's got to be spinning in his grave. But look, JJ's job is to make a successful picture and to make money for the studio, and he did it in spades. Now, whether those types of movies are going to be, and I'm not an expert at this, and it's not my field, but whether or not these types as all the TV series that we've had before, I suspect that in the long run that they're not going to be as profitable, because the television shows build a very, very powerful foundation that's an amazing tapestry of history and technology. And one of the wonderful things about the show is the amazing continuity, and that people who love it, who love the show, they love learning it all. They love knowing it. They love being in the know. And that has created a fan base that likes to buy books, that likes to read the novels, that likes to buy model kits because they want to see all the technology, the little details on the ships. The new audience that has been brought in, this is just my opinion, I have no way of really knowing, but I suspect that the new audience, where they say they're going for a broader audience, those people, they don't do that. They don't have to have the next Star Trek novel. They don't need blueprints of the ship. They just want to go and have a good time for a couple of hours and then forget about it, move on to the next thing. There's like nothing wrong with that. But I think that eventually the studio is going to realize that. And I just have my fingers crossed. There's no way of knowing that, even if they do a television show, what is going to be its aesthetic, and what is its point going to be, Star Trek is a very special show, and it sounds almost silly to say that a television show is very special and changes people's lives, but it really has. People find it very inspiring, and it's weird. It's almost as though there's some kind of genetic switch in us that makes us respond to this, optimistic vision of tomorrow. I mean, everyone wants to know that we're going to be okay and we're going to make it. But I mean, in a way, almost all science fiction about the future is optimistic, even if it's apocalyptic, because there is a future. But Star Trek is really about human potential, and that's what I loved about it. I mean, when I was a kid, I remember that in 1964 there was the New York World's Fair, which was one of the most amazing. Was probably the last gigantic World's Fair that we've ever seen. A World's Fair, before there was internet, before everyone had television, before all the instant communication, they used to have World's Fairs that moved to different cities. And in those fairs, you could go and see all kinds of marvelous things that you'd never seen before, technology, picture phones, moon bases, all the kind of the stuff that Star Trek is about, where you go and you get excited by human potential. And Star Trek really was sort of a World's Fair of the airwaves, where you could, well, I mean, actually, now Matt Jeffries was the production designer on the original Star Trek, and I had always felt that the 64 World's Fair was the basis of Star Trek and its aesthetic look as well. And I got to know Matt very well, and I almost felt like he was an uncle. And we spoke about it at length, and he confirmed that the New York World's Fair was like ground zero for Star Trek. Star Trek picked up that mantle, and there really isn't another science fiction show. Well, I mean, you could go on the Discovery Channel and see shows that talk about colonizing Mars, or catching a comet, or intercepting an asteroid or something like that. But Star Trek took all of that stuff and mixed it up with characters that we loved, that we fell in love with, and that we could identify with. And that's what was so appealing about it. People love to know that we're not through, that the best is yet to come, and when it's shown to you in such an entertaining and fun way. I mean, Star Trek storytelling is really fascinating and really interesting kind of storytelling. It really wasn't like the other shows that were on at the time. Even the manner of speaking, the way they spoke, it was it was larger than life. It was almost operatic. But the interesting thing, and I know I'm probably going to get off track here a little, but now Gene Roddenberry started off. He was a police officer with the LAPD, and he wanted to write for television. He saw TV. He thought he could do just as well, and he ended up breaking into the business. But I think that one of the most pivotal shows that are the roots of Star Trek really are an old Western that ran from like 1956 or to 1962, I think. It was called Have Gun Will Travel, and it was about a character played by Richard Boone. And this is the show where Gene Roddenberry cut his teeth. And he wrote 24 episodes. And if you're really interested in seeing the Star Trek style, the roots of Star Trek type characters, I don't know if it's on Netflix, but I'm sure that on or Amazon. I don't know if you guys could get Amazon down there. But check out Have Gun Will Travel and see where Gene Roddenberry learned his craft and how much influence that television show had on Star Trek. And that type of storytelling as well had its origin in early television.
And I think it was described too as a wagon train to the stars too, Star Trek.
Well, you see, the thing was to sell it to network executives. I mean, we still do it today, where you mash up a title. It's this mixed with wagon train to the stars. It's when you're trying to sell a project, you can't go in with like a book this thick that tells about your show and how it works and the ship and the characters and how they interrelate. Most executives are way too busy to ever take a look at something like that. They're running more than one. A lot of stuff is on their plate. They need to hear Wagon Train to the Stars, and that's what we call high concept. You go in, you don't give them a book, you give them maybe 2 or 3 pages on what a series is about, because if you haven't gotten the idea across that in a page or 2, you've lost them. They're on to the next thing. So Wagon Train to the Stars was just a brilliant way of getting that idea across fast. I mean, at the time, I think 80% of television probably was Westerns. Westerns were huge. The biggest shows on the air were Westerns. It's funny because when I was a kid, and actually I grew to hate Westerns because I always felt that, what's all these Westerns? And I can't even have Star Trek for more than 3 years. I blamed the Westerns, But the Westerns were so huge that any way that you could explain Star Trek that sounded like something that they already understood and was already successful, that's going to help you get your show on the air. So it was a brilliant description.
And it grew from there. I mean, it did labour a bit for 20 years, waiting for Next Gen, but then Deep Space Nine and Voyager. And then that's where you came into Star Trek, makeup and visual effects on the series, and also a couple of cameos. Well, and that's why I love following you on Facebook, because all of these little stories come out.
Well, thank you. Facebook is really amazing. I mean, the people that I have a whole community of people that I'm friends with I never would have met from all around the world. It's really stunning. You talk about those 20 years where nothing was going on, but what was really, really interesting about those 20 years was that the fans picked up Star Trek and kept Star Trek going with their conventions. And I mean, there was a huge amount of fan fiction that I'm sure there is today as well. But back, the fans were, I had mentioned the fanzines. The fans started writing their own magazines and distributing these things through the mail, writing their own Star Trek stories. And the fans deserve a huge amount of credit for keeping Star Trek going. And Gene always knew that. And he always thought of the fans. The fans were always very important to him. He realized how important that they were. But for those years, it was the grassroots that kept Star Trek in the public eye. Actually, more in the public eye than it was when it was on the air, because those Star Trek fans were militant. As a matter of fact, I think the network. I know that when the Save Star Trek campaign happened, there was picketing outside of NBC, and they were bumper stickering executives' cars, and people were afraid. They'd never seen anything quite like it before.
And I think those scenes reminiscent of saving Star Trek were repeated about a decade ago with trying to save Enterprise. And I remember it a little bit because that's when I sort of became more prolific online and joined a forum, Trek United, and it was the big Save Enterprise campaign there. They raised
amazing.
about $1 million in one of the first examples of crowdfunding, I reckon.
You would think that would be impressive, wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, by today's standards, but I guess also too, it's been taken on now by Joss Whedon and the Veronica Mars series.
See, the problem is that there was more going on behind the scenes than bad ratings, and honestly, Enterprise's ratings were never that horrible. I mean, Enterprise was doing as well. I was on Battlestar Galactica for 5-6 years or something like that, and Galactica did about the same numbers, and Sci-Fi considered it to be a hit for them. I couldn't tell you what the story is that was going on at the time. I suspect there was some politics going on there, but the very idea that the fans would raise that much money and that it would go unnoticed.
Yeah, I guess, back then I didn't really have a full appreciation for ratings and how TV networks operated, but having been in Australian commercial TV now for about 6 or 7 years, I have this appreciation of how intensely and closely the networks focus in on those ratings. And also learning a bit more about the network that Voyager and Enterprise were on, UPN. It wasn't as readily available as, say, the big networks, CBS, ABC and NBC.
That syndication package idea was brilliant. That was the way it should have been done all the way through. It goes to the individual stations and they put that thing where they know the audience is. And it worked brilliantly. I mean, Deep Space Nine and TNG were monster hits. UPN just wasn't everywhere, and it's just not going to get the same ratings.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, I certainly feel that there was nothing character-wise or story-wise or development-wise that was the issue. I mean, Voyager was just as good as Deep Space Nine, and Enterprise a little bit more so. But it did take me a long time to get used to it. But now I couldn't imagine a Star Trek without it. The only thing that is common is the network.
The interesting thing about Enterprise, and that was a whole, whenever a new show comes along, it always starts off, TNG, the fans weren't excited about TNG when it first came out. They didn't like Captain Picard. They didn't like the Enterprise. Every show that comes along, it offends a certain part of the audience because they don't want to see anybody replacing the people that they love who've been coming into their living room every year for the last 7 years, every week for the last 7 years, going to be replaced by who are these people, these upstarts. Now, there's been a backlash against every series. There was a big backlash against Enterprise. I don't feel it was really I'm not saying it was potentially, it never reached its full potential. I thought it was starting to hit it by around the 4th season. But if you talk to people who started watching the show after all of that hubbub that went on, they watch it and they enjoyed it. And they tell me that it's one of their favorite Star Treks. Fan psychology is very, very fascinating. And I totally understand where people are coming from when they're not happy with the show that's replacing their favorite show. Actually, to tell you the truth, I never quite had that problem. I love TNG right away. I know the first couple of years were a little bit shaky, but you could see that the potential that it had. I thought it was fantastic. It's one of my favorites.
And the Blu-rays have come out now, and it's just incredible to see all the special effects and seeing it again as if it was shot yesterday. I've also found that season 1 and 2 of Next Gen just aren't as 80s anymore. The 80s style dialogue, the guest star with a mullet, something 80s, it's just not there. Nothing against mullets, of course, but I'd love to grow one.
What is this thing with mullets?
You look at it now and all the visual effects are current. And have you had a chance to see it?
Well, I worked on the 2nd season.
Sorry.
The thing about it, the thing about it is that one of the reasons why Star Trek always feels current, I never felt the dialogue sounded like the 80s, no more than I thought that the dialogue in the 1960s Star Trek sounded like the 60s. It had a dialect of its own. I mean, it's actually closer to, say, if you watch the 10 Commandments, with Charlton Heston, where people don't speak with contractions, and I think that's part of why it kind of remains timeless, because if you watch if you watch some of the shows that were done back then, they're very dated. They sound like they were done back then. Now they remastered TOS as well. I think that it looks absolutely gorgeous. I can't get used to the new visual effects, though, I have to say. They rip me right out of the show. They don't look like the show to me.
That's sort of what I got as well. And of course, they redid the effects for TOS, but with TNG, I think it was all remastered from film stock.
TNG was like 98%. They had 98% of the shots as elements in their vaults, which is absolutely amazing. And we got to look through some of that stuff. It was incredible.
And I think that's a testament too to the production crew that had the foresight and even the archivists to keep all of that camera stock. I know these days that everything's just taken down to a broadcast HD master, and you've got 4 channels of audio there, so you can break away your music and effects away from your dialogue, but that's really it. No one really keeps camera stock anymore because it's all off hard drives, and it's just as precious as film stock.
Well, that actually is an issue on some of the later shows, how they're going to deal with that if they want to upgrade them. The beauty of TNG is it's film stock, so you're able to go back and get a much better, quality image from that.
And I think I had heard that a Star Trek website had done an article. They'd found some templates from the original CGI files to be able to create remastered CG effects, which of course Deep Space Nine moved to in the later seasons, which would cause a big problem if CBS Digital ever did decide to remaster Deep Space Nine. A hugely costly expense costly exercise to recreate all those space battles as faithfully as possible.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I haven't actually heard that myself. I worked at Foundation Imaging on Voyager, and I know all the stuff was rendered at standard definition. It wasn't rendered at HD. So there was never any footage rendered out as HD on Deep Space Nine or Voyager. Enterprise, a different story, because they knew they were shooting that in HD, which is why they were able to come out with the new HD, Enterprise episodes without any problem. Deep Space Nine and Voyager are going to be a little bit of a problem. if files can be gathered together, and I know that we're at a point in television where keeping all of that content and all of those files, and see, the studio itself doesn't even really understand how it works. It's like magic. It's not like they understand film stock. They don't really understand saving all those digital CG files. And the thing about the CG files is that it's not just one file that's the scene, that they rendered everything from this, okay, here's the scene. I put it back in the computer. Hopefully I have all of the models to draw from so that when the scene opens, it pulls it all back in. That scene isn't just a matter of pressing a button and letting it render and you've got the entire scene. When shows like Voyager or Enterprise or especially Galactica, there would be for one scene that was a visual effect, there might be a half a dozen light wave scenes. One file is for spec hits, one file is for diffuse, one file. It's a gigantic puzzle that it would be like archaeology. It would be a lot harder than doing TNG or Enterprise, a lot harder. I'm not saying it's impossible, and I would hate to see those shots recreated, because sometimes you get someone who doesn't really understand the look of the show working on things like that. I have to say, for me, and I apologize if I'm offending anybody, but I thought that the remastering of the visual effects for TOS does not capture the flavor of the original series. It looks like it was, it doesn't look like it doesn't cut in well with the 1960s footage. It looks like it was done later.
Doug, I've just had Los Angeles Master Control tell me that we've got 4 minutes left.
Oh, I've hardly even talked about what I do on the show yet. What do you mean? Show out another $100,000.
So very quickly, I think that's what I love about Next Gen, is that they haven't redone it. They've just remastered it, and it's the same as it was back then.
I agree 100%. Since we're running out of time, I just should say that if you're watching this and you don't know who I am, that's no big deal, because hardly anybody knows who I am. But, however, as far as Star Trek is concerned, I probably held more positions on Star Trek than anybody. I was a makeup artist, I was a scenic artist, designer, illustrator, visual effects, all of those things. And the reason why I was able to do that is because Star Trek, the Star Trek that we had, was such a wonderful working experience. It was an amazing, close-knit family that was together for like nearly 20 years. So a guy like me, who comes to a TV show that he grew up on and loves, which is an amazing opportunity, and I started as a makeup artist, when you get to be a part of this family, and me, who loves every bit of, I don't want to be a makeup artist my whole life. I look over at the art department, I go, man, that's amazing. And because I am friends, I get to know Mike Okuda, and everyone's, I end up in the art department. Or I could slide over to visual effects, because in the art department, we work very closely with the visual effects department. But I think that it was a very unique situation for me, and it was very unique. I don't think that you see that sort of thing on many television shows. I think a show has to be around for a long, long time to build that kind of family environment.
All right, Doug, lastly, in 30 seconds or less, tell us about the Facebook campaign that you're supporting. It's Bring Star Trek Enterprise back for Season 5 on Netflix. Go.
30 seconds. Well, Enterprise never got to finish, and we felt it was just getting its sea legs when it got canceled. We're all dying for more introspective, thoughtful Star Trek, and I know there's a lot of people who would like to see Captain Archer and his crew get a chance to do that. It's a campaign that was really started up by two friends of mine, Jen DeSalle and Robert Bolivar, who really have put in the lion's share of work. But I've been there with them, and I support it 100%. And I would just love to see it happen again. There's a lot of great places that the show can go, and I'd love to see somebody come back who really, really loves Star Trek. I mean, we had Manny Coto towards the end of Enterprise, who was I've seen pictures. I saw pictures of him in his pajamas watching Star Trek when he was like 5 years old. That's the kind of, You want a writer who grew up like that, who really just loves it to pieces. You know, J.J. Abrams, I love a lot of J.J.'s stuff. I loved Alias. Alias was a terrific show. I loved Fringe. But I don't feel that J.J. really loves Star Trek. As a matter of fact, he's as much as said that he really is a Star Wars kind of guy. And I think that you've got to
wrap it up, I'm afraid.
We're done?
Oh, no, we're done, I'm afraid. We'll have to tee it up again next time, maybe for the 15th?
Okay.
Or maybe a little bit earlier.
Hardly got started there.
I know. Doug, thank you so much for your time, mate. Really appreciate it.
I'm not giving up my microphone. Forget it. You're going to have to drag me out of here. I'll talk to you later. I'll see you on Facebook.